we've done a lot of those actual business conversation activities to where we said, okay, what if this did happen, right? What does this really do to our business? What does that mean to us, right? How much would that cost us either reputationally, actual dollars, what have you. So, it's a tough subjective balance on where over securing really lies. But to me, I think that really comes down to those answers from those business leaders on, okay, in this situation, if this did happen, right, tell me what happens to our company.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to industry leaders and experts about the past, present, and future of DevSecOps and AI security. We aim to help you bring developers and security together to build secure applications while moving fast and having fun. This podcast is brought to you by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down. Snyk makes it easy to find and fix vulnerabilities in code, open source dependencies, containers, and infrastructure as code, all while providing actionable security insights and administration capabilities. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Secure Developer, where we dive into all things application security and about development in a modern world. I am delighted today to be joined with David Imhoff, who is the Director of DevSecOps and Product Security at Kroger. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing, Danny?
I am doing awesome. I always love talking security and software development. I know you've been in this space for a while, so maybe you could just introduce yourself to the audience, and we can start with that.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Dave Imhoff. I've worked at a few different companies, kind of got my start at General Electric, doing a lot of the more of the blue team type things, right? Intel, detect, response, things like that. Really kind of love cybersecurity. Interestingly, I kind of took what I call a walk in the wild and ran an engineering organization for a couple of years to kind of help get a couple initiatives off the ground at another company. So I've lived in the engineering world and really got a taste for what that is to deliver software. And, with that knowledge, came back into the security world where I plan to stay for a long time, hopefully until I retire, trying to use that knowledge of engineering and engineering practices to make sure that, as we implement DevSecOps and any of the tooling, things like that, that it's actually useful and helpful and enabling for developers and engineering teams to reduce our risk versus, just throwing some things over the wall and maybe they work, maybe they don't. So, been at Kroger for a little over a year at this point, and just really excited at some of the things that we're doing.
That's awesome. And you touched on something that's interesting to me. Sometimes the guests that I have in the show have spent their entire career in application security, and you have obviously spent time on the software development side. How important do you think it is to have that software development or software engineering experience in order to have a strong AppSec program?
That's a great question. Honestly, I think it's critical. I don't know that you would have needed to run it for several years, but I think having real exposure, not just superficially and being kind of around and adjacent for engineering teams, but actually being embedded in understanding their problems, I think is super critical. I had a lot of reflection moments as I was sitting on the other side of the table in the engineering role where I kind of had moments of, oh my gosh, I don't like this at all that's being done to me right now. And I definitely did this to teams in my other role. So I think like anything else, right? It's really good to understand kind of the nuances of those worlds, the things that they are fighting, the things that they see, and the priorities that are pushed upon them, and to really understand how you can fit in there in a way that's going to be sustainable and helpful versus just making an assumption, thinking that, oh, it's security, they just have to do it. I'll just send them this list of things to do and I'll just put them on a scorecard if they don't do it, right? That gets some results, but not great results. So long answer to your question, but I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, I love that part about the empathy and understanding what they've gone through. I've been in software development myself, and I know that historically there's often a friction there. Something is imposed upon you, and if you can understand that, making things frictionless obviously is a solid way of putting them and bringing them onto your side. That's awesome. So I guess what I really wanted to dive into in this episode is talking about implementing a security program for large organizations, because this is something that we deal with every day at Sneak. We have customers like yourself, or we have partners that we work with. And often the biggest challenge is knowing where to start. So when you first come into a role, and I know that you've been in regulated industry, this is, I guess, more of a retail or grocery industry, where do you start in trying to implement or roll out a DevSecOps program?
Yeah, good question. So this may just be my defense background or compliance background, but I always start with the regulations, right? What are the must-haves? What are the things you absolutely have to do? Because, those are the things that could potentially get you shut down, right? Or fined or that, right? So if you're not doing those must-dos, obviously it's a massive problem. So first, I make it a point to really understand the compliance frameworks that are applicable to the space. This one was a little new to me. I hadn't had HIPAA, regulatory issues, that we faced before. So first thing I did was close that gap, right? Really understand HIPAA, what's covered, what are the systems that could come into that scope, things like that, and really trying to understand the controls that we have to have in place for those environments. Luckily, I knew the rest of the compliance frameworks by then, but that's definitely number one is what does it take to be in business, right? Then I think the next thing is really understanding kind of the culture piece, right? I would probably do both those things in tandem, to be honest, because depending on the culture, right? In a regulated environment, it's a little easier, I would say, to have a culture of security, and because you just have constant reminders of it, right? A lot more challenging when it's a lot less regulated or not necessarily regulated in a lot of areas. So culture became incredibly important here, and really understanding who are the people, that really lead things, right? And I don't just mean position of leadership. I mean, indirect leadership, influence. Who are the people that kind of make the decisions? Who are the people that are going to be the people that are making architectural guidelines, right? Best practices, things like that. And then also understanding, there's always nuance to organizations, and there's always conflict between what some of the different organizations are asked to do. So I think it's incredibly important, especially in large companies where you have more of a tendency to have a lot of bigger organizations that are led, right? You kind of get more drift as you get more scale. So understanding their goals and objectives, and probably most importantly, how they interact with each other or don't interact with each other. Because the most challenging thing from a culture standpoint, for me at least, has always been trying to figure out how to make a security standard, right, or a program that is company-wide, while also making sure that it is adaptable and will be adopted by these different organizations that may or may not like what you have to say, or may or may not play nice with each other.
I want to put a pin in the culture, because I think that's super important. And I know that, or I believe that you have a security champions program and you've rolled that out. But if I go back to the regulatory side of this, is there a framework that you have to collect that data for to push upward in the organization? And is there a stick downward in the organization? Is that something that you have to influence, or it's mandated from the top and you have to communicate the regulations upward?
So it's a bit of both. We basically use NIST, right? NIST CSF as the guidance framework. That is what we communicate as the kind of health metric to our board and to our stakeholders. We are constantly we do annual NIST assessments, right? Really trying to check the health of the organization, how things are going. And there's a lot of understanding and buy-in of what that metric means. I'm sure not the nuances and the kind of the second, third level as you kind of get into what the controls are and things like that, especially at the board level, right? I wouldn't expect them to understand that. But they are very interested in how we're doing from a score perspective, how we're doing against our peers from a scoring perspective. They want to make sure that we've got the right amount of security, right? As do we, right? We don't want to over-secure or especially under-secure things, but, that definitely is near and dear to their hearts. The other thing that they're very concerned with, and that everybody in the leadership team is concerned with, is vulnerabilities in general. They are surprisingly well versed, or not surprisingly, sadly, well versed about supply chain security here, right? Especially, third party software supply chain security. They're very well aware of a lot of the third party and upstream supply chain attacks and all the consequences that they've seen. So they ask about that quite a bit. So we get a lot of top down support on those things. Now, on the other side of the coin, right, a lot of our spaces aren't regulated necessarily at all. There's a lot of things that we really should do. Obviously, I'm biased as a security professional on things that we should do, and they don't always share that sentiment. But, there's a lot of things that we should do that I really do have to push up, right? I do a lot more work here than I've had to do in the financial industry and the defense industry for obvious reasons, right, that we've touched on. But definitely a lot more influence in this role, a lot more educating and pushing security upward and getting that buy-in.
That makes sense. And for those who aren't familiar on the podcast, the NIST CSF is cybersecurity framework. I think it has 5 components, David, if I'm right, which is identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. I think it's scored out of 5, and I think the industry average is 2.89, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going by memory here.
Yeah.
Do you compare
right.
yourself to the industry average or to the vertical that you are situated within? How do you compare yourself? Is it peers or industry?
Both. We look at industry and overall, right? So, company size, right? Other enterprise, large organizations, obviously, giving, some leeway on super heavily regulated industries where they have to be a 4 or 5, right? But, but especially we're very aware of how we're doing against other retail companies, especially our size retail companies, and just the industry in general. We don't want to be, the slowest gazelle, right? That it's just kind of more of a soft target that gets hit because they know, oh, well, yes, they don't have to be secure in a lot of these areas, but I know that I can take, you don't have to be regulated to need security, right? But yeah, to answer your question, we compare against our peers and the industry and generally companies overall.
That aligns with what I've been seeing in the industry. We actually at Sneak do the same thing. We compare ourselves with the NIST cybersecurity framework as well. And like you say, you don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to be faster than your nearest neighbor in the industry, which is kind of a crass way of looking at it, but it is the reality. It is the return on investment. You made an interesting comment. You don't want to be over-secured. And I don't think a lot of people pick up on that. Sometimes I think you need to be secure, and I always tell them that's almost impossible to be completely secure. Yeah. There is a point, there's a law of diminishing returns. Is that a documented law of diminishing returns, or is that really just you're looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework and saying, well, we want to be 10% higher, but not 30% higher?
Yeah, it's not necessarily documented. We just, through conversations, baselining against peers, things like that, right? There are certain areas, I will caveat it, right? There are certain environments where we do want to be as secure as possible, right? Health data, card data, right? Those we lock down as much as we possibly can. The environments that aren't in that, that's when we really start having kind of the cost benefit conversations of, okay, well, what's the real risk, right? And we've done a lot of risk appetite conversations with our business leaders. Our BISOs, our business information security officers, are aligned to those folks, and we've done a lot of those actual business conversation activities to where we said, okay, what if this did happen, right? What does this really do to our business? What does that mean to us, right? How much would that cost us, either reputationally, actual dollars, what have you. So, it's a tough subjective balance on where over securing really lies. But to me, I think that really comes down to those answers from those business leaders on, okay, in this situation, if this did happen, right, tell me what happens to our company. And does it make sense to you from a business and finance aspect to pay X to avoid that issue? Or is it better to kind of take that risk, right? Ultimately, they're the ones running the business, right? I'm a big believer that we're here to consult, inform, really make sure that they understand the ramifications of the decisions that they're making and make sure they're really well armed for making those decisions, right? and then they
That's a
can make
very
the decisions as they see.
Yeah, that's a very pragmatic way of looking at it. Really is risk identification and then risk mitigation. You just touched on one aspect that I always think about in implementing a program on the people side. So there's obviously people, process, technology. On the people side, you mentioned business information security officers, I think I heard you say. Talk to me about the people side of this. What are the things that you have done to roll out a program that supports people, both in terms of identifying champions or education? How did you
Yeah.
approach that side of rolling out a program?
Yeah. So did all the things that everybody would do, right, at first, right? Consult Gartner, like look at best practices, things like that to kind of get a baseline. What do people generally do? Everybody will tell you to create a security champions program. The thing is, that means a lot of different things depending on who you are, what you're doing, and what you're doing. And I'll touch on that in a second. But, outside of that, it's really making contact with those engineering teams to understand where are their problems right now, right? Kind of taking a look at the teams that are either kind of take the highs and the lows, right? So we took a handful of teams that were really on the cutting edge, really, automating everything. They wanted everything baked into their pipelines and really seeing like, okay, what is working here? So we can point to that, right? So like, hey, look, because, there's always a big variance, right? We have thousands of developers. So there's always going to be one team on this end of the spectrum and one team on this end of the spectrum. So we took the advanced teams and said, what's working? Right? What do you do? What can we kind of proliferate here? And took a lot of lessons there, wrote those down. They were doing a lot of great things. Also worked with them to figure out like, hey, here's some gaps that we see. What are your thoughts on that? Right? Really including them in those brainstorming processes is important, right? It's like anything else. If you can make your idea their idea, it's a whole lot easier on everybody, right?
Yes.
So that's kind of the play, right? Is helping educate those teams that were kind of in that pilot on that end of the spectrum to say, okay, what would you guys do, right? Are there things, and we got a lot of good results out of that. A couple things that honestly I didn't think about right out of the gate that we implemented, and it was an easy sell because that was engineering, ideation for engineering, and they had their own communities of practice. They pushed it. We helped educate, and we find ourselves a lot of times, saying like, hey, we'll help make it a policy, right? If people start to push back, right? Because everybody has a different idea on how to engineer something, right? And they're all the best ideas, right? Of course. And then for teams on the other side of the spectrum, right, where, maybe they were kind of, because there's always a shorter staff team that has, applications that, while important, aren't the sexy applications, right, at the time, right? But a lot of times those applications are very business critical or can be that haven't necessarily gotten the love because they don't have the new shiny thing. So understanding from their standpoint, okay, what isn't working here? What are your difficulties, right? Where do you have issues? And then kind of pairing those groups together to figure out, is it technically feasible to kind of bring them up to those cutting edge teams from a technology perspective? But then also figuring out, okay, there are definitely things that won't work, right? I can't put something in that's only going to work on a really advanced pipeline that is out in, AKS running on the latest and greatest tech, and then go to somebody that's got some on-prem server that's on VMware that hasn't been touched in 20 years, right? That delta is not going to work. So understanding what from an overall program standpoint could work for everybody while not excluding those folks that have critical applications but maybe haven't gotten all that love. So yeah, it's really, to answer your question, it's really about making contact and working with those teams and really understanding and walking, in their shoes for a little bit to see what the situation is here.
And are those security champions or business information security experts, are they self-selecting, or do you go and assign them across the teams, across the thousands of developers, it sounds like?
Yeah. So we went to the engineering leaders, right? The engineering VPs, kind of told them, hey, here's because they're part of the engineering organization, right? So I had to make sure that they had buy-in, showed them the value, right? Hey, we did a pilot. Here's what happens when you actually implement the right tooling and processes. you're going to spend, X amount less time fixing things in production, and look at all the things that we've avoided actually getting into production, the whole shift left piece, right? So showing the results while you're kind of selling them on the program, but then asking them, for candidates, right? And we did have to do it a couple different times, right? Because, maybe sometimes people were multitasking, things like that, right? That like, oh yeah, yeah, I'll get you two names, right? But we asked the engineering leaders for folks that they thought would be best for those roles. We went at that a few different times, had a couple different iterations, but really they ended up kind of, for the most part, right, where it works best, they made it part of their HR and career pathing discussions with their folks in their organizations, where they said, okay, maybe you're ready for a next step, or maybe you want to show that you're ready for a stretch assignment and you can do more, or maybe you're looking for that kind of half step in between, lead engineer to architect, or maybe you might just want to be in security and you want to test it out. So they started having those HR discussions with their people, and walked through that and said, okay, here's the handful of people from my organization that I think would make sense here. And then we kind of have a feedback loop on how things are going.
That makes sense. And I like the idea actually of the badging or certification, because it gives them career progression. It shows career progression and understanding of their space. On the process side, how centralized is it in your organization? In other words, do you set a policy that this is the way it has to be, it goes through the pipeline, and at this point X happens? Or is it less formalized than that? I guess I'm interested in how centralized or decentralized the process implementation is of the product security program.
Yeah. So it, like anything, it varies a little bit, right? But generally, right? So we have company-wide OKRs, right? Objectives and key results that are measured weekly. So that helps quite a bit. We use those to really anchor, that's the outcome, right? The value and the outcome of what we're trying to do. So
what's an example of an OKR? Just so like specific.
Yeah. So one of our OKRs is vulnerabilities introduced within the first 0 to 30 days. So, something that, the objective is to make sure that, it's all the shift left security piece, right? It's, save money, time, make the engineering easier, reduce vulnerabilities by implementing tools like Sneak, right? In the pipelines. So that OKR is essentially the measurement that we constantly review and go over with the leadership team of how are we doing toward that. So it's kind of a carrot stick hybrid, right? Everybody wants to hit their OKRs because they're very visible. They roll up and people do care. So that gets people motivated to perform that outcome and reach that outcome. So that's very centralized. The other piece that's very centralized is, I own the application security policies and standards and guidelines. So, that's your formal, hey, you have to do it because, here's the policy. It's Kroger policy to do X, Y, and Z. Now, no policy actually works without a good exception process and being able to talk through and understanding where you might have exceptions, nuance, things like that. So we definitely have a formal process where, if folks can't, for some reason, meet that policy, or they have, they need more time, right? An example of that would be, you have 30 critical vulnerabilities on this system. Yes, and, right, they tell me we need an exception for a year because this is a massive modernization effort and it's going to take this much time to do this whole piece, right? That's when they centrally get an exception for that. Outside of that, when you're getting into things that are more, like was a Sneak example, right? So Sneak, alerting and blocking on if you have vulnerabilities, right? We use GitHub Actions. So, in our GitHub Actions, you can either alert or block based upon severity of vulnerabilities that you're about to introduce, right? So that is where we do give the leeway to the engineering teams to say, okay, you have to at least alert, right? We want you to be aware of things. We would really like you to block if that makes sense for your product that you're working on, your workflow, or kind of your that business's appetite for risk is another factor there, right? I don't want to mandate things across the board that get into that deep level of engineering process, because you'll have so many exceptions for a lot of times very valid reasons. But trying to set the, you have to do this baseline, which is achievable by everybody. And that's the art of it, right? Is figuring out what baseline is achievable by everybody. And then that guidance of, look, we really want you to get here. We will hopefully shift that baseline when everybody can get there. Our goal is to get everybody there by X date. But if you can do that now, we would really like it. And by the way, we're going to publish teams that are already making that kind of second step, really kind of doing the celebration piece, right? So teams get a pat on the head, right? That they did those things. So it's a little bit of both. You have to have the centralization, but at the scale we're at, you also have the acceptance, right?
And so I've met companies that implement the process both through the pipeline and through the source control management system. It sounds like you have done, I heard you use GitHub Actions there. So it sounds like you do more on the pull request, on the source control, as opposed to the pipeline where you're doing that type of assessment. Is that accurate? Yeah. On the process for documentation, you said you publish centralized documentation. Do you require the developers to attest to reading it or certifying on that? Or is it just published and available? Like, what's the process of pushing that information in the policy out to the development teams?
Yeah, good question. So we have a learning management system. You can assign required courses or optional courses here. We have to pick and choose what goes in there, right, across all of security. So we all try and work in as much of our areas as we can into the security awareness training that everybody has to take. In that training that everyone has to take, right? There is training that if you are an engineer, there's a couple different things, right? If you work here, you have to take this awareness training, and if you're an engineer, you have to take this additional training. There are, it touches on all that. In a couple of the areas, it goes a little deeper, depending on kind of what the subject matter is. But it also, has you basically download and link to a reference guide so they know where to find policies, procedures, things like that, right? That's the tough part, is making sure people find their way to the one of millions of things people need to reference, right, as they do their jobs. But yeah, we do have a universal security awareness course and step up course if you do that.
That's great. And on the technology side, I know that you're a customer of Snyk, and I don't really want to dive into that. That's not the intent. Sure. I guess just from a category perspective, what are the categories of technologies that you're using? So you talked about supply chain, so I presume you're looking at open source components. What other categories of technology? And I'm thinking in my mind like DAST and SAST and secrets and APIs, and like what types of tools are you using and technologies in implementing the program?
Yeah, so definitely started with the SCA and the SAST piece, right? Really trying to get a handle on our code assets themselves and the asset management related to that, right? The application security posture management space has been incredibly important here. The asset management piece is probably the most critical, I think, out of this program, right? It's not necessarily a piece of traditional security tooling, but if you don't know what your code is and what, the actual data classification, regulatory flags that might be on that application that has that code, then you can't really apply the right controls, right? So that, ServiceNow, I'm sure it's not a surprise to anybody, we use for our CMDB, making sure that is really intact. And then we are, we're constantly iterating, but we've got API runtime going right now. So, really making sure that, because we have a developer portal, right? So third-party developers externally can use our APIs. We want to be an ecosystem that people can freely use. It's part of our business model. But with that, obviously, right, is we have to have a lot of API runtime security, because it is kind of open to everybody that can register and get a token. So API security runtime there, and the inventory pieces. And then DAST, we kind of have a mix between DAST and, depending on certain criteria, we might do, an actual, say, red team, but kind of an app scan and more of a human consult, like those PHI, those PCI environments, get a little more white glove than, letting a development team just kind of review their generated dash reports, but we do have both of those. And then, secrets has been a really big one. We have had secret scanning where, I'm sure like most everybody else, right? Secret scanning is really hard from a true and false positive perspective. So,
Yes.
we're constantly looking to figure out how to kind of increase the signal and drop some of the noise in that world. So secret scanning is definitely a big one. And then, it's interesting because where the worlds kind of blur, right? We have, a cloud security team. So where the world of, infrastructure as code and container runtime security exists, we have some tooling there where, we are kind of looking to step up our game and close some loops on, both organizationally and from a tool and reporting standpoint. We have, like everybody, right? We have a lot of tools that we really need to work to make into a cohesive story and one view of risk. So a lot of things going into kind of that, I don't want to say single pane of glass, that's an overused term, but a more cohesive view of all the alerting that is happening, so that, the thing that is near and dear to my heart, right, is that we are sending 9 different things to an engineering team and saying, hey, these are all the important things from security, and they aren't prioritized against each other, right? That it's one view that we say, okay, you own this application and platform. Here are the security things we care about, and they're kind of risk ranked in terms of, if you can only get to the top 5, these are the top 5 to do, right? And so forth.
Is that cloud team that is doing the cloud security assessment, are they integrated into the ProdSec and application security team, or is it a distinct team over on the operations side?
It's a distinct team, but we do talk pretty much every day. So
okay,
it's one of those, we're not technically in the same, we're both in security, right? My peer runs that, but we're not technically the same org, but as things just become code, right? As the technology goes, the organization kind of goes. We're really finding ourselves acting more like one organization in a lot of cases.
And I know that everyone is talking AI these days. You didn't mention any AI tools. Are you using, or what are your thoughts maybe, using generative AI tools on the development side? And does that impact security? And how do you think about that? Because I know I hear every day about Code Assist and Code Whisperer and Copilot,
Yeah.
AI.
Yeah.
How do you think about those from an application security perspective?
We went through Mitless, and a couple of the NIST has a framework, right? Really trying to stay up with the frameworks and the guidance and everything that's getting created. First thing we did was say, okay, AI, big scary thing, but what does that actually mean for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we did an exercise to look at the delta of, okay, software development, has these attack vectors. What are the additional attack vectors that, we need to also add on as part of, AI preparedness? So one of the biggest things that stuck out was really dependency management on steroids, right? Pulling in the right models, right? Most people are not creating an LLM model from scratch. So pulling in the models that are available, making sure they're actually the models that you think, right? Just like pulling in a bad library that's typo squatted, things like that. Same thing with LLM libraries. You pull in a bad one and it's not great. So really making sure that we've got the dependency management piece buttoned up around that. And then the data poisoning is kind of a new thing that we're honestly still brainstorming on, iterating on, working with a lot of folks. We have, we definitely have detection for a lot of that stuff, but it does present a lot of very new challenges that you really have to think about differently and make sure that you're not assuming that something is as easy as you might want to think it is, right? To me, poisoning is pretty straightforward. So just make sure that we limit the places people can get training data for those LLMs and make sure that those are not malicious. But when you really look at how to do that and how fast that space is expanding, and it's kind of like the Wild West, that's a pretty scary proposition. And
it's an interesting. Go ahead.
AI
Sorry.
firewalls, everything else, right? Like just trying to make sure that as things kind of present themselves and as people find new and innovative ways to break it, that we're in that perpetual fight that all of security people are in, where we're trying to catch up and prevent them from breaking the thing that's new. So,
well, AI is definitely changing the space. We see it being used
yeah.
in everything from obviously code generation, but also in the security assessment and in fixes and in reducing attack surface. And I do think it's going to change the industry in very significant ways. I guess two more questions for you, because I know our time is almost up. You're a year into this and you've rolled out a program. What's the best advice you would give someone if they're tackling rolling out a program similar to what you've done across thousands of developers in a very huge organization? What is your best advice or first advice for that individual?
Network and make friends. You know, the number one thing, like you can't do this from sitting in this office, right? It'll never happen. So, really spending a lot of time in investing in making sure that you are seen as a friend and not a foe or an impediment that is legitimately trying to understand their problems and help them with their deliverables in a secure way. Without that, this program or any program will never go anywhere. Right? It's too easy to just ignore people, especially in a company this size.
It's actually an interesting point that people overlook. There's historically been so much friction between security and development because they've slowed them down. And ultimately, it's a relationship business of making friends and allies and partnerships within the organization. I like that. And I'm a big believer in the same thing. I always say the technology is easy. It's the people and process, which is where you find your challenges.
People are tough.
People are tough every time. Last question. I always end on this question. AI is obviously changing the world. If you could take AI and automate one part of your job that you're doing right now, what part, and it doesn't have to be security related. I'm just curious. I'm always looking at how do we actually use technology to make our lives better. What part of your job would you take AI to solve it or smooth it out or make it better?
Honestly, so it's interesting. I literally had this conversation this morning. It would be finding a way to use AI to implement threat modeling. To me, that is the hardest thing in the world to do because it's so manual for teams to do. It takes so much education, and then they have to actually care enough and think about it in time to do threat modeling and to think about possible attack vectors. If there was some way to use AI to just magically help people at the right time, the right place, perform threat modeling or derive, at least pull up, what are the potential threats that I should be designing for as I talk about this product? Hands down, that would be it.
Well, you've touched on a point that I loved. We could go for another hour on threat modeling because that's a discipline, as you know, that's been around for 20 years and no one has really solved it. And I do think that AI has a massive part to play there in addressing something that fundamentally is the furthest shift left. We talk about shifting left. Threat modeling is really the furthest left that you can possibly get because it's identifying the systems and then the mitigations that you should have in place. I love that answer. And maybe we have to have you back on to talk specifically about threat modeling. Is that a practice, David? Sorry, I said that was the last question. Is that a practice actually that you employ across the organization? Is that part of the process for the development teams?
We try really hard to.
Yeah.
It's to your point, right? It is the furthest left. The hardest thing is just getting embedded in their minds enough to where they're actually in the ideation phase that they bring you in, right? Because it's impossible to know where to be if you don't know when they're thinking about building a new thing, right? So we have some success, but like I'm sure, like every company I've ever worked, and like I'm sure every other company in the world, like some people are just not programmed to think about you as security when they're trying to think of the next thing they're going to build. But we certainly try to push that and do everything we can to spark some kind of, memory of, oh, I should bring in security. They make it this easier, right?
Yeah, I always say that the win of threat modeling is not the fact that you come out with the artifact of a threat model, which is important. The win of threat modeling is simply just the awareness early in the cycle. You're really building a culture, to your first point, a culture of security within the engineering organization. Well, that is fantastic, David. Thank you for joining us today and talking a little bit about deploying the program. I know that that's something that a lot of organizations struggle with, and understanding your experience and what has been successful has been very valuable. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great time.
Excellent. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on the podcast. We look forward to having you next time. And until then, stay secure, keep coding, keep delivering. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to The Secure Developer, brought to you by Snyk. We hope this episode gave you new insights and strategies to help you champion security in your organization. If you like these conversations, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share the episode with fellow security leaders who might benefit from our discussions. We'd love to hear your recommendations for future guests, topics, or any feedback you might have to help us get better. Please contact us by connecting with us on LinkedIn under our Snyk account, or by emailing us at thesecuredev@snyk.io. That's it for now. I hope you join us for the next one.